All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm gonna give it maybe like a minute more just to allow people to log in. Have people in the waiting room, so we want to make sure we get everybody in here, their audio going. But welcome, happy Friday. Yes, so excited for the weekend. A few more people are joining us. Welcome. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. It looks, hopefully nobody's struggling with. Okay, so welcome. We're the Women's Collective Rising Speaker Series. Thank you for being here again. My name is Liliana Mora. I use she, her, ella pronouns. I'm a peer advisor at the Women's and Gender Equity Center. You may often hear us referred to as the WGEC. So I'm happy to be here today introducing our rising speaker, Julián Delgado Lopera. Just as a reminder, we are going to have a Q&A session at the end, so it'll be an opportunity for you to unmute, hopefully get a more direct conversation going, and ask your questions. So be thinking of those as we're talking. And then, so the mics should be muted right now, but we'll make sure to adjust your settings so that you can unmute yourself when the time comes. But definitely type in the chat. We want to get your reactions. We want you to really be engaged and get the most out of today. We have an amazing speaker with us, so I'm excited. And we are recording, so definitely check out the video after. We'll be posting to our YouTube, so share that as well. We think it's a very important conversation we're having today. So if we could switch slides. We did want to start with acknowledging the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of the Los Angeles Basin and the Southern Channel Islands. We're grateful to have the opportunity to work at the sacred site of Womxn. We also want to pay respects to the ancestors, elders, and our relatives, relations past, present, and emerging. And of course, we also want to recognize and acknowledge the labor upon which our country, state, and institution are built. We remember that our country was built on the labor of enslaved people who were kidnapped and brought to the US from the African continent. We recognize the continued contribution of their survivors. We also acknowledge all immigrant and indigenous labor, including voluntary, involuntary, trafficked, forced, and undocumented peoples who contributed to the building of the country and continue to serve within our labor force. We recognize our country is continuously defined, supported, and built upon by oppressed communities and peoples. We acknowledge labor inequities and the shared responsibility for combating oppressive systems in our daily work. So just for those of you who may be new to us, to the WGEC, we're actually under the Division of Student Affairs. So our mission is to foster an understanding of gender that is continuously evolving and advocate for those facing gender-based oppression. So our work is really rooted in advocacy, of course, community building, education, and self-empowerment. And so one of our initiatives at the WGEC is the Women's Collective. And the Women's Collective is actually student-led. So it really is meant to be an empowering community among women of women students of color at Cal State Long Beach. And the Rising Speaker Series is one of our programs. So we have a speaker come every semester. It's an opportunity to invite professionals to present like on critical issues in our community, and of course to build awareness, and even do some identity exploration. I think that we often forget, right, the intersectionality of our identities. So that's something that's important to us. It's one of our guiding pillars. And as I mentioned, our collective is student-led. So this year's student council, on this year's student council, we have Lisa, Kenya, Angelica, Fatima, and Vanessa. They come to us from different majors, different year levels too. One of our students is actually a graduate student on campus. So we're really bringing students together to be leaders. So we just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge their work and recognize the dedication that they're bringing to building this collective. So for the best part of today, I've talked enough. I have the honor of introducing our speaker, our rising speaker, Julián Delgado Lopera. Julián is the author of the New York Times acclaimed novel Fiebre Tropical, which was the winner of the 2021 Federal Grumley Award and a 2021 Lambda Literary Award. Julián is also the author of Quiéreme and Cuéntamelo, an illustrated bilingual collection of oral histories by LGBT Latinx immigrants, which won a 2018 Lambda Literary Award and a 2018 Independent Publisher Book Award. So Julián's received fellowships and residencies from Hedgebrook Headland Center of the Arts, Brush Creek Foundation of the Arts, Lambda Literary Foundation, Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, and the SF Grotto. Their work has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize and has appeared in Granta, Teen Vogue, the Kenyan Review, McSweeney's The Rumpus, and many more. And they're actually also the former executive director of Radar Productions, a queer literary nonprofit in San Francisco. So please, help me use your emoji reactions. Let's welcome Julián, who's joining us today.
Hi, everybody. Hola todos. Thank you so much, Liliana, for that introduction. That was amazing. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you, Cal State, Long Beach, and thank you for the Women's Collective for bringing me. I am Julián Delgado Lopera, and I'm in San Francisco right now. It's a really beautiful day over here. I hope everybody's enjoying their Friday. So let's see. I'm going to be sharing a presentation with you all. I guess before I start, one of the things that I was telling Liliana is that there is a chat function, and since I cannot feel you and hear you, and you cannot like snap at me or something, so if there's something that you feel, we can have like that chat kind of like as a communal space for all of us to see our reactions, and then hold on your questions, like write them down on the side, and then at the end, we're gonna have plenty of time to talk a little bit more. And I'll answer your questions. But feel free to just kind of use the chat if you want to. All right, so let me do this. Let me share my screen. See if it's gonna work. Okay. I hope this works. I'm trying to do this weird PowerPoint sharing screen situation. Okay, can you see just the like part of the screen that you're supposed to see? Is that a yes? Okay, cool. All right, everybody. So for today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my formation as an artist. I'm a historian, I'm a writer, I'm a storyteller, I'm also a part-time drag queen, I do drag. And specifically, I want to talk a little bit about language and kind of like my evolution with language. Because I am an immigrant, I speak 2 languages or 3. Inglés, Español, and Spanglish. if it was my mom, it would be inglés, español, spanglish, and mierda. So yeah, so I can speak three languages basically. And so I want to talk a little bit about this evolution of language, how we see language, how we experience language, what are like, you know, the systems and the powers of they that are also kind of like having their force on us as we're all experiencing language. And so let's start from the beginning. So I am originally from Bogota, Colombia, which is in South America. I grew up with a lot of women. I grew up in a matriarchy. My mom has 5 sisters. These are my mom's sisters. That's my grandmother in the middle, very 90s. And my grandmother had 5 sisters. I grew up in this huge matriarchy. And every single Saturday, we were all gathered together around aunties, which are the Colombian equivalent of the English tea, but we drink chocolate and eat bread. And we gather around every single Saturday, and I would just watch my aunts speak. Again, there's 10 of them, and a lot of them are just, you know, talking about their husbands, talking about like, you know, the rising prices at the grocery store, just, you know, complaining about things. And I would just sit there as a kid, just watching them talk and just kind of really marveled at how amazing they are as storytellers. I don't know this yet at the time, but I know now in retrospective that my most formative years as a storyteller kind of happened around the dining table, watching all my tias smoke cigarettes and talk shit. And so, you know, I was always so in awe at like the creativity that they had with language. They will mix words, they talk a lot in modismos and slang, which is one of my favorites. And so, you know, like they're also very expressive. And so people from Latin America generally, people from Colombia are very expressive with their hands, with their mouths. So they were just all these really beautiful and great storytellers. Here are a few examples. So, you know, even though they were all telling a very similar story, right? These are all women who are, I think they're all like maybe 3 years apart from each other, 2 years apart from each other. So they're all narrating very similar, kind of like feminine experiences. But they're all kind of putting a twist to their story. And so, you know, some of them, for instance, my tia Te would just say, da hijo de tu madre, complaining about her husband. And my tia Emmy would be like, ay, what is wrong with this man? Whereas like my mom would just kind of like just sit there and complain, like silence. This is, you know, part of like in a family where like silence and sighing has a huge space. So if anybody grew up with a lot of women around you, you know that there's a lot of sighing and there's a lot of silences that cannot be taken for granted because they are very charged. And so I was so in love with their gesturing and how part of language was kind of like the performance of language and the use of hands and the use of mouth to point. And I wanted to just bottle up all their energy. I was so in awe and I was learning from them. And so I want to stop here just for 1 second for all of you to just like think about and sit with like, who are the beautiful storytellers in your family or chosen families? So it doesn't have to be your birth family. It can be like people around you. Like, who are like the beautiful storytellers that you have in your community? Just like sit with that for 1 second. It's like those people that you don't know what it is, but you sit with them and they just kind of like take off, right? Like they just have this way with language and this way with talking that is so beautiful. You can just watch them and watch them speak. So I want you to just kind of like digest this a little bit and see like, who do you have access to that is a really, really wonderful storyteller? So I'm going to be a little bit of a stereotype right now and talk about telenovelas because I have to. I did grow up watching telenovelas. I grew up with my grandmother a lot. Every day after school, I would like get off the bus and run up her building and I would be like, abuela, la novela. And so we would sit in front of the TV and I would sing the opening of Dos Mujeres, Un Camino, which I will spare you right now. Unless we were live, maybe I'll sing it then. But so my grandmother and I would sit in front of the telenovelas, and I learned a lot about dramatic action and narrative and storytelling through telenovelas, believe it or not. And you know, telenovelas are like the best at delivering heartbreak, right? And so the telenovelas bring another dimension of storytelling into my life. And this is, with my grandmother who lets me play in her house. We both sing, and it's just this beautiful way that language exists in this really playful and alive way. And I just, I realized how much I love that. I remember going back to my room when I was a kid and just kind of like playing with that too, like singing again the songs, the lyrics of the novela, kind of like rewriting a little bit of them, and just being so immersed and in love by this specific use of language. And so this is the picture 1 week before I moved to the US. I was 15 years old. That's my Catholic school uniform. Good girl Catholic school uniform. I moved from Bogota to the land where all the American dreams die, which is Miami. I got there, I moved in with my grandmother, my sister, my mom, my aunt lived around us, and my cousins. So there was a lot of people around us. But this migration from Colombia marks a very specific and important moment in my relationship with language. Until this moment, I lived and kind of understood my world and in Spanish, right? So the Spanish from Bogota with Caribbean tones, because my family is originally from Cartagena, which is a city in the Caribbean of Colombia. But all of a sudden, like, I don't have Spanish around me anymore. I mean, I do inside my house, but then there's this kind of like this looming dark mass that is constantly after me, and it's English. And so, my world starts to feel a little bit like a labyrinth, like I have this like Spanish that I navigate with my family, and some of my friends are Colombian and Venezuelan, but then I have to go to school and I have to interact with people. And I went to a bilingual school in Colombia, but I learned what I call very basic English. To anybody here who speaks another language or has learned another language, you understand that it's very different to know, hello, how are you? My name is, than to actually be able to have a conversation and kind of like live fully in a language, right? Like language is kind of like our access into the descriptive world. It is in itself a whole experience. I know that, for instance, I am very different when I'm in English than when I'm in Spanish. I'm a different, there's a different part of me that comes out. And so, basically my anxiety went over the roof. I was just like, oh my God, like, how am I gonna navigate this? All of a sudden there's all this friction between my native tongue, Spanish, and then the English world that is outside me that I cannot negate. I might have to go to school. And so all the cultural codes, right? I learned them all in Spanish. I learned all the cultural codes that are Colombian. And then all of a sudden, I have to go into this world and kind of like learn cultural codes from here. So the first thing that happens for me with language is that I start writing all my essays phonetically in Spanish, just so that when I read them, I can actually read them. So this is all written phonetically in Spanish. I'm going to read it to you. My name is Juliana. That was my birth name. I am from Bogota, Colombia. I like to read. What do you like? And so this is just, my name is Juliana. I'm from Bogota. I like to read. And so this is the way that I would start writing all my essays, because I used to really love language. But then when I moved to the US, all this language love really shifted. Not only because English was so inaccessible, it was just like the specifics of the English that was inaccessible, which I'm getting at in a moment. And so when I moved to the US and landed in Miami, all that energy and love for language disappeared. It was here that I had my first encounter with language hierarchy. I was 15 years old and we were reading Romeo and Juliet in English class. I begged and prayed that I wouldn't be called to read Juliet's part because it was long and I didn't know what most of the words meant. But of course I was called to read Juliet's part. My heart sank. When I said I didn't want to, the teacher responded that I would lose participation points if I didn't. Okay, I had to read it. I tried to push my tongue in impossible ways. I tried to echo the sounds that I've been hearing around me, but I butchered all the words. Everyone around me laughed, and the teacher just stood there silently. I clenched the desk, wanting to disappear, wishing to be made small, invisible. So that day, I went home that day and told my mom I was not going to go back to school because that laughter and that ridicule created a deep fear and anxiety inside me. I was speaking differently, and this clearly was wrong, right? So like I started learning that there was one way of speaking, that there was one way of approaching English, and clearly I was doing something wrong because the kids were laughing at me and the teacher was letting them. And it was really sad because I couldn't access that part of myself that was so deeply excited about language, because my way of speaking with an accent or inventing words or pronouncing words in English as I heard them was deemed wrong. I said things like conflate instead of cornflakes, and I mixed both languages. I used Spanglish a lot. I was mixing both languages. And so I also was noticing that in class, it wasn't only me who was being punished and ridiculed. I watched my teachers correct a lot of my peers, usually anyone who wasn't white, shaming a lot of immigrant kids for saying quota instead of quarter, la pinabora instead of peanut butter. I think all of us were crossing an invisible language boundary line, a boundary that was policed by the teacher and maintained by the students' laughter. And so, right, all of us who are speaking English in some different way are getting laughed at. And so this just means that there's some border of language that we're crossing and we're not really noticing, but there's a border clearly of language that is there and it's being kind of maintained by the teacher. So I also remember staying up late, practice pronouncing words so the kids at school wouldn't make fun of me. And I hated myself for not fitting in, not realizing that there was a hierarchy much bigger than me at play here. I felt I was the one who was wrong. And so this happened to me, and I've heard from a lot of other people who are usually people of color in class who just feel like they're the ones who are wrong. And so, my approach to language wasn't correct. And so the teacher was really telling me that there was one way of speaking English and one way of writing English, and I was doing both wrong. But on the streets of Miami, there was a very different kind of English being spoken. So I wrote the 3 ways that people write Miami in Miami, which is Miami, Miami, and Miami. And these are just Goya because it's Goya, then there's the tostones because, I love fried plantains. And the picture of Sao Gigante, I took one time that I was at the Miami airport and this woman looked at me and I was like, oh my God, this is the embodiment of Miami. Like that sassy look, the auntie sassy look and like the Sao Gigante thing. So yes. So this is, on the streets of Miami, we went to the Cuba grocery store with my mom, and now at my grandmother's dining table, there was a very different type of English that was spoken, right? There was this English that had no boundaries. My tia, my mom, they started playing with language because they were in a new place. So now it wasn't only Spanish who made it to the dining table, it was also English. I remember the first time my mom learned how to say, oh my God, which she pronounced, oh my God. And she would not stop saying, oh my God. And it was, oh my God, para arriba, y oh my God, para abajo. And so, I have cousins who came to the US 2 or 3 years before, who are already speaking with an American like little to their tongue, and we start playing with language now inside the house, and so we're existing in this very different kind of language, right? In this place, like language doesn't have that rigid boundaries; it's more playful, right? English and Spanish were not mutually exclusive; we're not two separate languages, but rather they were close. They were open circles touching each other. So all of a sudden Spanish is not this like really rigid thing. English is not this rigid thing, but rather they're more open. And, this is kind of like the experience that I was having as the year passed. My own linguistic experience started being just these 2 languages coming together. It wasn't fully Spanish and it wasn't fully English. It was like the experience of these 2 coming together. And it was also just like the language was a mix and match of the previous Latin American groups that were already in Miami. So I would, like a good weird art kid, I would just be sitting in the corner watching my tias and just writing stuff down that they were saying. So this is some of the stuff that I was writing down. which is give me a trapo, I have to plancha it, or just as ready, moments or chanclas. And so this is, this is just this really playful, beautiful way of approaching language, one that is like funny and it's enjoyable. And, every time I would say something like this, somebody will laugh in my family. And so it just started to feel like this was accessible to me. This is language that is actually accessible to what I can do. And Spanglish doesn't really come with a dictionary. You cannot just go and take a class on Spanglish, and you kind of have to live it, and you kind of have to know it. And this happens to this is language that happens like that for a lot of subcultures and for a lot of cultures. You kind of just have to spend a lot of time in it and be part of that community to be able to have access to it, right? Okay, so this is just a little text message exchange. I'm going to contártelo todo when I see you. I'm going to tell you everything when I see you. Cabrona, tell me ahora. Cabrona, dime ahora. No, oh my God, what a jodation. And so I'm pointing this out because of the amount of creativity, imagination, especially sass that Spanglish usually has, right? It's just like there's a lot of humor, there's a lot of rhythm, and there's a lot of imagination that plays a huge role in Spanglish. So I'm going to take a step back here and explain a little bit of, like with the diagram, how we actually think of language generally as a culture. And we tend to think of language, in this case, is English, as kind of like a closed circle. Well, all of us English speakers exist. A closed circle where what we call correct English is elevated at the center, and it's right there. When someone says something in another language, we know it is outside of that circle, right? So we hear, hola, ¿cómo estás? Okay, that's outside of English. We have the little English bubble right here. When someone speaks English with an accent, without proper grammar, or like mixing words, right? We know it is inside that circle, but it is not correct. So it's not at the center. So we push both the language and the people who speak it to the margin. And so this is what I have right here. It's like you kind of have the like really solid circle, which is correct English, and which is AKA white English, because the language is racialized, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. And then everything else falls into this kind of liminal space, right? It is all kind of pushed to the sides, made up words, Spanglish, slang, English spoken by other like ethnic minorities. So there's a lot of Black scholars who have touched upon this, about how Black English is also kind of tossed to the side and looked at as inferior. But what we really don't consider when we're treating language this way is as a closed circle, right, with a solid center, is that it excludes so many people and so many ways of speaking. And in this case, the center creates a hierarchy of language. And this hierarchy is in turn racialized. And so the English that is correct, the English that I was taught in school, the grammar that was correct was standard white English. And we see that it has linguistic legitimacy. And so what that means is that we see it spoken and written everywhere, right? Especially in formal settings, so like politics and journalism and literature, which is why this is relevant to me. It's like when I went to school, I did not read any when I went to school in Miami, and again, I was in a suburb in Miami. I did not read one book that reflected back kind of like my linguistic experience. And my linguistic experience was this in between. And again, there's 50 million Latinos in the US, so it's not like some like weird language that nobody knows about. Like there's 50 million of us, and we're like, next door. So it's, so we have no linguistic legitimacy. And, I also learned about the hierarchy by watching the way that people were really condescending with my mother at the grocery store when she was kind of blending both languages, trying to be understood, or how I was treated in school for speaking with an accent. And so this mixture of English spoken with other languages, in this case Spanish, is this for like discarded, right? Like we're just seeing it as like whatever. And this discarded language generally does not make it to literature. So yes, you can go and like have like stores, in LA that say like Julio's Tacos, Sandrito's Lavanderia, or we can watch Shakira say a few words in Spanish, or we have this unregulated spaces that are also very non-threatening. So yeah, you can do it in your house, you can do it here and there. But if you write a story and literature is seen as like, the high art of language, then people flip. Yeah, I tried publishing also a book and people were just flipping because this hierarchy permeates literature and writing. It permeates all the spaces where we are. And, Spanglish is this kind of discarded, illegitimate spoken language that can never really be real. And so, like I said before, I want to stop here to just say that this is not solely for Spanglish. It just affects me personally, but there's a lot of work that a lot of Black scholars have done, again, on Black English being very much perceived similarly, and also kind of like how English was being used as a colonial tool even for Indigenous people when the English came here and Indigenous people were put in boarding schools to kind of strip them of their culture. And so, language is really powerful and it's really important how the words that we use for one another. And for a lot of our communities, that language is kind of like the glue that puts us all together. Like at least for me, like I know when I see another Latino who can do that back and forth with me of Spanglish, it just feels really beautiful. It's this way of being seen that feels so profound. And I can imagine for other people that's similar. And so, like language is powerful, and it was and that's why it was used as a colonial tool during colonization, and it's still being used like that because it's incredibly powerful. That's how we understand ourselves. And when we lose that language, we lose like kind of like ancestry, right? Like there's a lot of ancestral codes that are written in language. And so there's a lot of that is here. So it's not only about the purity of language, it's about like, whose stories are being told and what's the history of that language and the history of that story and whose history is being carried on through language. So with that, if Spanglish is wrong and, Spanglish or any other like minority like language is wrong and standard white English is correct, then who's being understood and whose world is called into life, right? Like who are the kids getting chastised in schools for speaking differently or for using grammar differently? And so I'm going to move a little bit into talking about, so I talk a little bit about Spanglish, and I want to move into, I'm also a very flaming transsexual, I'm a homosexual, and the gay bar has been crucial for me. And so now that we're speaking a little bit about how this language is very important to subcultures, I'm talking a little bit about queer subculture and the importance of language for us too and what it does. And so Esta Noche was a bar that opened in 1973, and I'm also a historian, so I love this shit. Esta Noche opened in 73, and 16th Street, if you know San Francisco, 16th Street used to be the mecca of like transexualismo y mariconería latina, so Latino faggotry during the 90s, before the techies gentrified the city. And there were a lot of gay Latino bars, and this one was one of the last ones standing, and it closed about 6 years ago. So it was at Esta Noche that I stumbled upon the first Queena in my life. And Queena is the blend between queen and reina. And reina is queen in Spanish. And so this was the first time in my life that I saw drag queens on stage embodying language in such a different way, right? So I've been talking about, my mom and my aunties kind of playing with language at the dining table. I moved to San Francisco because my family was extremely homophobic, excuse me. And I land in this bar helping my best friend do her hair. So my friend was a queen. So I would go in with her, have her do the padding, help her do the hair, and just watch the show. And if anybody has gone to drag clubs, that drag queens are there to entertain you. They do not care about grammar. They do not care about full sentences. They are there to be sassy and fun, and to kind of like get your attention. And so at this bar specifically, at Esta Noche, what was really wonderful about it is that there were different generations of Latinos. And so everybody had kind of like a different access to language. There were a lot of second and third generation Chicanos who had a Spanish that is like, what I call the de la puerta para adentro, which is from the door inside, which is the Spanish that you learn in the house, which is the Spanish that you learn with your grandmother. And then there's a lot of people that had just come from Latin America who spoke no English. So the drag queens that were hosting had a really intense job of making everybody understood what they were trying to say. But, you know, their Spanish was also like very minimal. And so they found all these really beautiful ways of being extremely creative with language on stage and being sassy and fun. And so there was, so this is just like some examples of it. Sisi Marica, Fierce, Perra, Butch Papi. And so something else happened. There's like this really beautiful twist now that I go to the bar and I watch these queens do all of that. And all of that kind of sassiness and creativity really seeps into my own work. I am obsessed with oral storytelling, as I've been saying, as you can tell by now. I love oral storytelling and I love the relationship between orality and textuality, which means it's like, how do I get all this spoken word into my literature? How do I transfer all of this? I'm completely obsessed by this. But I'm also obsessed by it because it's my own history, right? Like it was because of all these queens who are there, and the queen that's here to the right, that's my trans mom, Adela Cuba, and the one to the left is Tina. And this is my own history, right? And all this language carries with it like my own ancestral knowledge of my own queerness. And so I'm obsessed with language because of this, because I know that it carries like all this beautiful cultural codes. And so it was with the drag queens that I was like, oh my God, I need to figure out how to embody storytelling differently. And so I really wanted to do what drag queens were doing on stage. And I was like, how can I do that? And so, you know, drag queens really taught me how to embody a story. They taught me that there's different ways of telling a story and of narrating something. And so I started doing drag and I started painting my face a lot and going into bars and just doing a performative read of my own work. So I was just really being inspired by that, by the stuff that I was seeing, the things that were really ringing true to me. And, you know, it was like embodying a different consciousness. And I usually say this because I really invite anybody, regardless of your gender, of your sexuality, to put on a wig and a pair of pumps and just walk and stroll around your house or wherever it's safe for you to do it. Because there's something different that happens with your body, you know, especially if you're someone who doesn't really play a lot with your clothes. Just do it. It's incredible the way that you feel just by being able to be playful. And so, you know, the magic of drag, the way that like language was being treated but also performed on stage really sank in for me, you know, and it gave me a lot of opportunities to like do something different with language. And so here is that's me in drag when the pandemic wasn't going on, and I was being called on stage. So there's something that I'm calling perreo auricular. Perreo is how people dance reggaeton, so it will be translated kind of to twerking in English. But it's like a sonic twerking, basically. So it's the musicality of language. And this is just me being both a queen and a nerd. So this is how they intersect, queenness and nerdiness. I call it this because it's this really delicious language that is kind of coming from popular language, so lenguaje popular is how you call it in Spanish. Reggaeton was born in really poor neighborhoods in Puerto Rico and in Medellin in Colombia. And so I'm also just kind of in very marginal spaces. And so like I'm kind of appropriating this term and, you know, focusing on all these sounds of language that really attract me, that are very liminal, that exist in this space where we don't really pay attention to language because it's not correct. And we dismiss it a lot as like whatever, yeah, you can use that in a song. Like music is allowed to do this, but literature is not. And all these spaces that are like extremely regulated, like politics, journalism, law, like language is so incredibly rigid, and literature is one of them too. And so this is just an extra addition to the graphic that I had before, which is that all this discarded language to me is like this really sonic twerking, basically. This really beautiful way that language is kind of like speaking to you in a way that is more intuitive, right? Because you can't really learn it. It's language that is intuitive. The same with queer language. As much as people, even if people watching shit ton of Drag Race, it sounds weird. You have to go to the club and you have to see the queens live. Like you just have to go and hang out with a bunch of queer people and do it more than, I mean, RuPaul's really nice. I mean, I love RuPaul, but also go to the club, go hang out with your queer friends and like develop your language, and it sticks differently. And so this is just to show you that all this liminal and all this discarded language, that is what makes it to my writing. That is what I love. And that's also what I've been really put down for. Like, I didn't know that I could be a writer I write in Spanglish, but the dominant is English. And because I'm not from here, it's not my native tongue. And I was told that I was wrong constantly. And I was just like, no. Wait 1 second. I'm not really wrong. I just have a different approach to language. And so I just want you to just sit with that, sit with like the things that maybe you've been told that are wrong. I mean, I'm approaching this out of, with language, but there's so many things that they get put on us as if we're wrong. And it's really just the anxiety of society. And it's really just white supremacy operating, right? And so like, this is just for us to just really pay attention. Now, you know, I have only a few minutes, but I want you to show the person that really inspired me. His name is Pedro Lemebel, and he is a Chilean writer. He was big homosexual, indigenous, kind of low income person in Chile who became very famous for writing his crónicas. And he was also an activist during the Pinochet years. Pinochet was a dictator, a fascist dictator in Chile. So he says, I could write simply, but my tongue is salty. So his writing is very rococo, is very embellished. He's always like, yeah, I could write simply, but I don't want to. This is how I want to write it. So I wanted to pay attention to what you pay attention. Some of the tools that I want you to maybe get out of this is to follow your intuition, regardless of how you think. You may not even know where that's taking you. I had no idea that so much love with like watching my aunties and writing stuff down. There was no purpose in that. I was 16 and I hated everybody. You know, I was just like, I hate this new country. I hate everything, but I'm just going to sit there and write everything that these women are saying. And just, you know, kind of really cultivating that relationship with your intuition and what it really calls on you. So I ended up doing this, and I'm going to read very, very briefly this book of oral histories. They're both in English and Spanish, and I collected some of the oral histories of my queer family. This one there is my mother. She is Adela Vázquez, and she's a trans woman from Cuba. So I'm going to read this very briefly. So this is from Nelson de Alerta, from Isla de Pinos, Cuba, 1980. This is my tia, my auntie. Catherine is my woman name. And when Catherine arrives, I say, por tu vida, she is here. Sometimes people ask about her. She's on vacation, I say. She's too much. I love her, but sometimes she's too much. She does things that we never do. She stops traffic. She talks to policemen. ¿Qué tal? How you doing today? What's going on? Makeup all over her face, a little drunk with a huge bag, going around to different bars. I never had a closet because my mom always said to me, you are a fag. She dragged me to a psychiatrist during the 1960s because as a kid, I wore high heels. I would steal my mother's clothes and go out to the streets in women's garments. I'm from a small island, Isla de Pinos. I lived there until I was 10 years old and moved to La Habana. When we arrived in La Habana, my grandfather took me to the opera to see Aida. He held my hand tight, saying, this is going to be your home. You're going to come back here many times. I was shocked, oh my God, because theater has truly been my life, dressed in a gown as a woman, never as a man. In high school, I dyed my hair, wore truly scandalous outfits and pink sunglasses. I would sew on the bus with my face all done weirdly like a woman. I wear bras and panties, tell the boys on the bus, I'm wearing a bra, you want to see it? They go crazy, they didn't know what to do. I mean, this was the 1970s in Cuba. I'll stop right there. And for the sake of time, I was going to read briefly this one, but this is just my mom in the 80s. And, you know, if you get the book, they just, you know, they talk about their life back in Cuba and then coming to the US. And, you know, there's a lot of mixture of those languages, and it's both bilingual, in one side dominates in English and the other side dominates in Spanish. So I want to end with this too. I have two little poems for you. Everything you notice is important. Let me say that a different way. If you notice something, it is because it is important. But what you notice depends on what you allow yourself to notice. And that depends on what you feel authorized, permitted to notice in a world where we're trained to disregard our perceptions. So again, this is just tied to what I've been talking about language. If you do not know that the way that your aunties talk, it's okay, and you really love it, you're just gonna dismiss it. So allow yourself and give yourself permission to be attracted to notice whatever it is that you notice. And this is a quote from David Wojnarowicz: "Your light is too much for this world to hold." Sometimes it's very true. And so these are the things to take from here. Creativity is the mother of the hustle. Pay attention to what you pay attention. Seek out others and support other artists. Work intentionally on your skills, and intuition, generosity, and kindness are essential. And here's a book read that is really good for artists, called "Your Art Will Save Your Life" by Beth Pickens. And so, yeah, burn down the house with your language and your tiki. That's it. Gracias. I think I was going over. Sorry, I'll still stop sharing.
No, sorry,
a little bit.
I didn't want to interrupt you, but definitely we can like pause here and open it up for everybody to, you know, whatever comments, anything, questions,
yeah,
resonated, and then we can go back to some of the stories that we didn't go to before, if that's cool.
Sure. Yeah, of course. There's one little reading, so if we have enough time, I'll read it, but I wanted to leave time for folks to ask questions and comments if they have any.
Feel free to unmute or drop in the chat too. Either works. Maybe while we think a little bit, process, and I'm dropping our survey in the chat. Just if y'all could take a minute just to fill that out now as you think about it, or later we'll also put up our QR code if that's easier. We really depend on your feedback for bringing amazing speakers and having programs. So please help us out and fill out our survey.
I think I would also love to hear if maybe you guys also have like similar stories around language that you want to share. I would love to hear that too.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Sulema just let me know that. Okay, y'all should be able to unmute yourselves now.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you for, you know, telling your story, because it does resonate with me. My family was, you know, I learned Spanish. That was my first language, but when you're here in this country, like, it's just kind of like pushed aside. They try.
I think you cut off there.
Sorry.
There you go.
I don't know. I think like for me now that, my dominant language is English, it's very hard for me to kind of go back to my Spanish roots. When I speak it very broken, and it frustrates me because I don't have that connection anymore. And I just wish I had someone like you, to kind of tell me, like, don't listen to what they say, and I just want to say thank you. I really loved your story.
Thank you, Zulema, for saying that and for sharing your story. It is really heartbreaking, and I think that what I'm getting at is that there's a system at place here for a lot of people to not have access to their ancestral lineage. There were also a lot of English only laws in this country, some of which are still standing, both in the 50s and in the 90s here in California. And so I know of people that were even beaten for like speaking Spanish in California, and the push to have in a lot of states like English only, and so English only education. And so, I think that the sad thing is that a lot of people internalize that as like, oh, I am the one who's wrong, when there's actually a huge system at play here. And I would just suggest, like, if you're feeling like shy and you really want to reconnect with your language, just start reading and watching things, and like have your own, like, have your own relationship, like reach out to your homies who also like have maybe a similar approach, or just like if they speak more fluent Spanish, you can just like practice with them and talk to them about it. I'm from Colombia, and I go there a lot. So like I speak the language fluently. And I have a lot of friends here who are second generation or third generation or first generation. And we just talk, and they talk to me in like choppy Spanish, and we work it out. And like it's a beautiful soup of like what everybody can bring. And so I think that is just allowing people to just be able to like make mistakes and just like be freely in their language. That's just, that's the beauty of it. It's like we all have a very different approach. And so, but definitely like just know that you're not alone in that, and that there's a history of the people being pushed to assimilate, that is incredibly violent.
Something I was thinking about, especially as you were sharing kind of the pushback with even like publishing books in Spanglish and stuff like that. I was thinking about my own experience in like higher education, right? And like this academic language, and like, what does that mean, right? It's just that like correct English that you were talking about. And like with all of us being in higher education, assuming all of us here, right, CSULB students, I don't know, just kind of like, do you have thoughts on how to navigate that? Like, how can we, because it feels like a form of resistance, right? Like, no, like it doesn't have to be this academic language, right? So I just wanted to maybe hear some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say that's really challenging, and like the moment that I actually like learned English was like when I started going to the university, because then I had to really push myself to write like that. And I think that the most important thing is just to have people that have a similar experience as you, to be able to just process what's going on, even, just to even have someone who can reflect back your experience and be like, yeah, I hear you, this is fucked up, like, let's just talk about it. I think that that's huge. And I think that for most people, it's like we don't even have that kind of like acknowledgement of our experience, and that's really frustrating. I want to say say that wherever possible, you know, you can take it on as a project if we are doing something in class and like research stuff around your own language, or like, you know, research stuff around your own like ancestral like storytelling modalities that you have access to. You know, it may not only be English, but like, for instance, like Western stories look a very specific way. So the hero's journey has a very specific way of being told, whereas like other countries and other cultures have different ways of doing storytelling. And so, you know, if you're interested, just start doing your own and maybe bringing it forth into the academia and like see how that plays out and see how much you can push. But if you have interest in something that is of your lineage, I think that going in, I mean, for me, the most beautiful way that I have not felt disconnected has been doing research around this and has been talking to other people around this, and like, you know, just coming here and like talking to you and hearing also about your experiences, and like that just makes me feel connected. I was like, oh yeah, there's like so many, there's 50 million of us here and we're still reproducing. And so, you know, it's like it's really beautiful. And the day before yesterday, I did a talk that was in Spanish for the UNAM in Mexico, and it was all in Spanish, and I was talking to everybody there, and they're having similar conversations in Spanish too, you know, about like the language, like, you know, and even in Spanish we have an academia, so we have an academy that chooses what's in it and what's not, which is just even more rigid. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not, I don't think that if you write a paper in slang, like people are gonna get it. But I do think that just doing like research on it and finding the people, like just being able to have that reflected and like connect with your own lineage, I think it's huge. It has been really important for me, and that's the way that like I make some peace with it. You know, like I go out and I have an accent, so it's impossible for me to hide it. But I'm doing all this work, so like it just makes me feel connected